Greetings, Mayhemers. So, have you ever had that sensation that you're being stared at or watched, only to turn around and find that there is somebody in the room, in fact, staring at you? What about the feeling that there's just some sort of mood that's in the air? Or some way that you're feeling because you had an interaction with a colleague or loved one who was having an emotional state that resulted in you having the same emotional state? How do you suppose you realized that you were being watched? Why do you think you sometimes experience emotions like sadness, happiness, anger, or fear when nothing actually stimulated that feeling in the first place? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about those two scenarios, and I'm going to relate it to the extra senses of the body and how they contribute to those hard to explain experiences. You may have watched a previous episode regarding mirror neurons and empathy. Now it's time to widen that scope a bit and see more of what we know our mind-body can actually do and what it does, whether we want it to or not. So let's start by talking about the senses. There's the five senses that we all learned about in school, and of course, weird psychic phenomenon and telepathy is always referred to as sort of like the sixth sense. But there are in fact much more than five actual physical senses, and we're going to talk a little bit about those. So the five that we all know about, I'm going to call those the traditional five, are sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch. So that's also vision, audition, gustation, olfaction, and somatosensation / tactition. In addition to those five senses, though, there are several others. Kinesthetic sense, or proprioception, and that's your body's ability to sense its own position in relationship to itself. So being able to close your eyes and touch your nose is proprioception. It's the most basic example of proprioception that I can think of. There's also vestibular sense. So the vestibular sense is pretty easy to explain. It's also called equilibroception. I think vestibular is easy. The easiest way to refer to it, though, is balance. That's really ultimately what it is. But more accurately, it's your body's ability to sense its position in relationship to its environment. So if you slip and fall on a banana peel and you throw your arm out behind you to brace yourself for the fall, that's a spinal reflex that's engaged with your proprioceptors and is part of your vestibular sense that's mostly regulated by the inner ear. But we also have thermoception, which is the ability to sense heat in a way that is slightly distinct from just the sense of touch. We also have mechanoception, which is the ability to sense vibrations in objects and machinery in the ground and the air and so on and so forth. In addition to that, there's nociception, which is the perception of pain. If you've done any study into the various senses of the body, you'll find that there are different receptors and mechanisms involved in all of these different things. So if you count those senses, you have 10. You have 10 physically identifiable, scientifically studied bodily senses. Okay. In addition to this, you also have chronoception, which is your ability to sense the passage of time. Chronoception works on multiple brain areas and is regulated by your dopaminergic pathways. So therefore, your relative sense of being happy or excited, or the absence of that, the absence of dopamine, affects the way that you perceive the passage of time. And I think just an easy reflection on your work week versus your weekend will probably tell you that story is true in your own experiences. There's also the sense of agency. Now, agency is usually like a sociological construct that determines a person's ability or belief or perception that they are making their own autonomous decisions. But it is also a bodily sense, and the way they found this was by the fact that agency is lost in brain diseases that have a component of organicity, like schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, where agency is actually reduced impaired or lost altogether. And this sense of agency is going to be one of the most important senses that I want you to think about as we move forward. That's that feeling of being in control, okay? That feeling that you're making your own decisions. All that being said, let's go back to our first scenario. How do you know that you're being watched? Well, for the longest time, this was something that fell mostly in the realm of paranormal psychology, and you could think of somebody like Rupert Sheldrake, who did a lot of research on scopaesthesia, or psychic staring, and that's that ability to detect that you're being stared at. Obviously, science doesn't like ESP as an explanation, so they repackaged the same exact idea as gaze detection. And what they found when they performed some experiments where they had somebody, standing adjacent to or behind someone, is that there were distinct brain cells that activated when the person was being stared at by the other person versus the other person's gaze only being averted by a couple of degrees. What they speculate is that there's an evolutionary advantage in terms of threat detection and responding to environmental cues that is associated with gaze detection. What they haven't done, though, is directly tie that into these existing senses, and I'm guessing that it's probably an integration of multiple senses and perhaps some of those non-local aspects of consciousness we've talked about in other videos. Now let's move on to that second scenario. Why do we feel things simply because another person feels them? Why do vast groups of people share emotional states simply because some person is feeling a thing? I mean, we all have so many feelings all the time. It's interesting that when you look at large populations and groups of people, is how many people actually share the same emotions about certain things, regardless of their experiences or differences. Well, the term for this phenomenon, it's called emotional contagion. It's closely related to empathy, but isn't exactly the same. It involves the mirror system, much like empathy does, but it bypasses a person's autonomy. Okay, and this is where I want you to think about that idea of agency, is that in emotional contagion, it's an automatic response. As a matter of fact, emotional contagion is considered to be bereft of autonomy at all. In empathy, there's a degree of selectivity and willfulness. That is, an empath frequently chooses to engage in interactions in which they absorb the emotional state of another. And although it can sometimes feel provocative and overwhelming, the empath still has an intact sense of agency and autonomy. And it's easy for an empath to get these two things confused because, often all of those things where you're feeling the emotions of others and you're being sensitive and you're picking up on those, subtle undercurrents of human emotions and stress and anxiety, it's easy to write that all up as empathy. Well, I'm an empath. This is empathy, and it hurts sometimes. It's overwhelming. However, both phenomenon are equally valid in terms of truth, and what I'm doing is helping to create a little bit of a distinction between the two today, because that's going to be important in the ongoing discussion. Basically, emotional contagion is having your own emotions and their related behaviors directly trigger emotions and behaviors in another person, or vice versa. Basically, they've looked at sort of some conscious aspects of this, like analysis or imagination, as playing a role in emotional contagion, but most of the research actually suggests that it's primitive, subtle, automatic, and sort of universal among humans about how emotional contagion works. You can see evidence of emotional contagion in people that aren't empathic, and I think that that's another distinction to make. Emotional contagion is very much a universal evolutionary feature, and it can be found in any kind of group, especially groups that share spatial proximity, like family life, work culture, social media, or culture at large. There was a pretty controversial Facebook experiment. I'll cite that in the description, but they basically filtered the content for emotionally provocative, negative content randomly among like 600,000 and some change viewers. And what they found is that social contagion is very, very much active and real in social media, and that really shouldn't be too much of a surprise. And in terms of emotional contagion, there's a couple of different ways that it can be viewed. So emotional contagion can be implicit, that is automatic, that it's just it happens without any sort of influence or willfulness whatsoever. One interesting evidence for that you might know from your own life is that moment where you sent an email to someone and they interpreted an emotion associated with that email. Right? Sometimes that interpretation is correct. Sometimes it isn't. The accuracy of that interpretation isn't what's important. What's important is that contagion piece. So what happens when they correctly interpreted your sadness or your anger or your irritation or your frustration in that email, and then themselves became sad, irritated, angry, or frustrated? Or vice versa. Let's say you didn't intend any of that and they interpreted those things anyways. What does that mean? I think that looking at both aspects of that particular example could be important, but I'm not going to sit and dwell on it very much. It's something you guys can talk about in the comments or in the discussion group. But what they found from that controversial Facebook study is that negative events elicit stronger responses and more likely to elicit contagion. That is to say that Mr. Positive talking about positivity and greatness and being uplifted on Facebook only goes so far in terms of the way we are naturally hardwired. Remember, this is about threat detection, right? It's about what our bodies are evolutionarily wired to do. Therefore, events or stimuli that are interpreted as threats are much more likely to elicit the mood contagion to respond to a threat than they are to respond in a way that is comfortable. And I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about this, because it's sort of definitely not a way that we want things to be, but I think when you look back and sort of speculate about the grand meaning of things over time, it makes sense, even if on an evolutionary scale it's a reflection of our primitive past. We can certainly see how that carries out in our modern life today. The other kind of emotional contagion is explicit emotional contagion. And explicit emotional contagion is when emotional contagion is something that is harnessed intentionally. And the most obvious examples of explicit emotional contagion that I can think of is in terms of workplace culture. So obviously, if you are involved in an organization as management or leadership or administration, things like employee morale, productivity, and work culture become important issues to consider when trying to manage your employees. Basically, what it comes down to in the workplace is the expectation of a reward or a punishment. So is it a threat or is it not a threat? It's not, is it a threat or is it something good? It's, is it a threat or not? Because it goes back to that same exact thing. Inasmuch that negative and adverse stimuli are much more likely to elicit emotional contagion than comforting or reward stimuli. So this is different than behavior. We know that behavior responds best to sort of positive reinforcement, the adding of something to increase a behavior. In the terms of emotional contagion in the workplace, sometimes adding stuff can lead to a reduction in behaviors, and that is because of that fact that the systems that are responsible for emotional contagion respond much more to those negative stimuli. Basically what happens in the workplace is that leadership manages according to and obligates emotional labor dictated by the organizational ethos and work culture. It can be a byproduct of intentional impression management. So let's say you have a coworker or a leader or somebody who wants you to believe that they're always okay. They're always okay and they're always okay. But then you, being the natural human being that you are, have that natural assumption there's something going on under the hood there. There's something wrong. I can feel it. Okay. That's emotional contagion, because oftentimes when we engage impression management in our day-to-day life and job, it's to satiate people's questions and not have them lose any confidence or have unwarranted concerns about us. However, the body does what the body does, and the body senses things, and eventually, as you get to know your coworkers better, you may end up finding something out about them, or they may end up coming clean to you in the long run that, yeah, there was something wrong that day. I just really wasn't trying to, put it out on anybody else, but it just happens that way. People don't think it be like it is, but it do sometimes. So anyways, this also, comes out in terms of intergroup dynamics and teamwork and things like that. It also forms and breaks alliances in the workplace. And it contributes to ultimately what industrial and organizational psychologists, call a group emotion. So if, let's say you have, somebody in leadership who's insecure or inconsistent or sad or upset or angry or narcissistic in nature, and you find that that's bleeding out all over your work environment, what ends up happening is the employee group, because it is a different group than management, ends up formulating their own group emotion that may be completely distinct and separate from that of the leadership. In a lot of these IO studies, what they found is that management actually has a disproportionate influence on the group emotion, because the leaders, whether they believe it or not, become more contagious. And there's a reason for that, and it goes right back to that threat detection. So why would a leader be a threat, even a good leader? Because I'm not just talking about poor leaders, I'm talking about leaders. And the simple fact of the matter is that your manager, your supervisor, your overseer, your overlord, whatever it is they call it at your workplace, is somebody that ultimately holds the keys to your ongoing security and future. They are the one who's going to fire you. They're going to be the one who's going to write you up. And no matter how great of a performer you are, that's going to be somewhere in the back of your mind, especially on those bad days or when something goes wrong, or it's performance review season or audit season or whatever kinds of weird crap inventory, whatever happens in your particular line of work, you're going to find that you have these sort of threat expectations that are attached to your leader. There's nothing they can do about that, I don't think, and I don't think there's much you can do about that. I think that that's just a natural dynamic about the way we run organizations, and there's some neurology behind this. So obviously, emotional contagion works in the mirror system, just like empathy does. Like I mentioned before, though, that sense of agency is what's different. So emotional contagion bypasses agency altogether, okay? Whereas empathy is something that engages agency. So there is that distinction, again, that I'll come back to. But what they found is that in terms of emotional contagion, there's some specific extra stuff that's going on. That is that the amygdala and brainstem do an awful lot of work when it comes to emotional contagion, because those are also the parts of the brain that receive and engage in facial mimicry. The parts of the brain that respond and react to nonverbal cues. But another important concept is limbic resonance. Okay, so the limbic system is sort of like a primitive part of the brain that's composed of several small brain systems referred to as the R complex, or the reptile brain. And that's because, evolutionarily speaking, long back in time, before we were ever mammals, our descendants were still reptiles, and our mammal brains evolved around that reptile brain, that R complex. So the limbic resonance is that description for synchronized emotions that occur due to the dopamine circuit for empathy, and for emotional contagion, it works according to the norepinephrine circuit, which regulates fear, anxiety, and anger. So the threat detection system is the one that goes off when it's detected as a threat, when it's emotional contagion. The dopamine circuit is what goes off when it's a reward. So they are distinct concepts. What they also found is that your brain chemistry, is specifically with these two circuits, are regulated and impacted by the proximity to others and their brain chemistry. So that's something to wrap your head around, is that it's not just some internal chemical response. It's a synchronicity. It's a resonance between two brains. And unlike empathy, the process is a little bit more automatic and a little bit less in your control. And that's where we're going to circle back again to agency, because I'm going to get to why that's going to be super important. So just to sort of sum that up, both empathy and emotional contagion work on the mirror system, and they both elicit limbic resonance. The main difference between the two is the neural pathways or neurochemical pathways that they use. So empathy is the dopaminergic circuit, and then the emotional contagion is that norepinephrine circuit. The other difference being the presence or lack of agency involved in the two. So remember that we're addressing agency as a sense, not just a construct. We're addressing it as something that is occurring in the body and that has an evolutionary function. Okay. So looking back at sort of the empathy video, I want you to think about what you learned when you watched that. And I want you to incorporate this new knowledge into it and think about, if you identified with the content of that empathy video, I want you to start thinking back and sort of teasing apart which of this is, more or less empathy. What is it that I am an agent of versus what am I afflicted by? That's another way of looking at it is the, emotional contagion is what it sounds like. It's the spread of emotions, and it's no less willful than the spread of the flu virus. Now, I'm not saying that it exactly works like the flu virus. However, I'm sure that there's an argument to be made that there's such a thing as a mimetic property of emotions. I'm not entirely sure about that, but could be worth some exploration in the future. Well, you may be asking yourself, isn't this all just obvious? Why is this important? Well, I'm going to tell you, it's important if you are a person who is conscientious of not only yourself, but your impact on others, but also in terms of the ways that you may choose to try to protect yourself. So a couple of reasons I can think of right off the bat that this could be important to all of us is that being able to feel good and have some degree of autonomy in our emotional space is healthy. Being completely dependent or reacting completely to the emotions of others can foster unhealthy codependency and inhibit healthy interdependency. And if you want to know sort of the difference between those two terms, you can just Google them both. Google codependency and interdependency, and you'll find that one is sort of a good thing and one is definitely not a good thing. But many of these processes, they occur automatically, but can be somewhat self-regulated if you're conscious and aware of them. It's just a matter of sort of looking around at your environment and yourself simultaneously and realizing what ways that you're attenuating and orienting to shared emotional spaces and groups. And it's definitely not an easy skill to develop. Personally, I'm kind of conscious of it, and I try to be as considerate as I know how, but there's always those days where, you're just in a frickin' mood, but once you walk out of your coworker's office, or once you walk out of the living room and you don't look back and you don't see, the way your mood is rolling out on everyone else. And then you come back and wonder why did this happen? I feel better. Why are you suddenly irritated? Why are you suddenly sad? Why are you suddenly upset? People, why? Well, it's because there is a definite ripple effect, emotionally speaking, in our shared emotional space. It's like we're all like in little boats or rafts or floaties on a pond, right? And every time we have an emotion, it makes a ripple that goes across the pond, and everybody else feels that ripple. Sometimes feeling that ripple is enough for somebody to make a ripple in response, right? Well, that all ends up adding up to some pretty big things when you look at the entire population. And it's hard to generalize from individuals or individual reaction and response to the population, but you have to understand that the population isn't the population without individuals. So it is that conglomerate of individual interactions that add up to these big pictures. So it's hard to be mindful of this on a day-to-day basis, especially when you wonder about why your own emotions seem to be oftentimes tumultuous or upset. And I know that in today's socio-political environment, and I'm going to always try to make my videos relate to what we're experiencing right now, because it's hard out there right now, and it doesn't show any signs of getting better. I mean, I've been reading articles and seeing pictures of how absolutely long the return lines are at our local Walmart, and I'm sure that's true nationwide right now. And I don't think it's just because people don't like their gifts. I don't think it's just because people are turning in gifts because they want to have booze. And if they do, who fucking cares? Shit sucks. Have a drink. What I think it is that life is fucking hard right now, and people are having to return much, 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 much more of their holiday gifts because they need the fucking money. I mean, and that's emotionally resonant. That's contagious. That's something that if you're not too busy with your fucking head up your ass laughing at these people, and you actually think about what it means, it's weird, and it hurts a little, and it's kind of fucked up. Okay, I mean, you can be whatever kind of asshole you want to be, but I try to look at meaning. I try to look at why things are happening. I'm not always right, but it certainly, I think, merits some further scrutiny. So, I mean, those are some reasons why, empathy and a knowledge of emotional contagion, and why a knowledge of our senses and how that all adds up to contribute to not just your own life, but to the life of society is super, super fucking important. Okay, but again, you may be asking, but why? Why is this fucking important? I don't really care about this stuff. I'm feeling good today. Well, the reason, if any of the other reasons I haven't given are good enough, if you go to the farthest end of negative human behavior, to the farthest end of adverse consequences in terms of shared emotional spaces, to the farthest end of emotional contagion, what you're going to find is a phenomenon called suicide contagion. Okay, it's also called copycat suicide. It's also called the Werther effect, named after a famous book by Goethe called The Sorrows of Young Werther that describes this sort of copycat suicide effect. I'm not going to get real deep, and I'm not going to mention any specific examples of these suicide clusters, or suicide contagion, but they do come in a couple of different forms, and that's the suicide cluster, which is when a group of copycat suicides shares both time and space, and then mass suicides, which share time but not space. Any environment where you have a lot of people packed closely together is much, much more likely to end up being a point cluster of suicide contagion. So I want you to think about that. Take a second and just sit with it. I don't want you to feel terrible about it. I want you to think on it meaningfully. I want you to think on it, in ways of how, your own input, your own output can affect and be affected by emotional contagion, your mirror neurons, your limbic system, your amygdala, and how all of these things play out silently in the background through our day-to-day lives, at work, at home, at play, on social media, when we're watching and responding to the news, when we're talking about beliefs, when we're talking about religion or politics or anything like that with a large audience. There's a whole lot of contagion there. I mean, there's also something called cognitive contagion, which is not too much different than what I'm talking about right now. So, moving forward, I want you to understand that the reason why this is important is that we're all affecting each other's emotions automatically, whether we're trying to or not. And this affects the behaviors and beliefs of groups, and also by default, it affects us personally. It affects me personally. It affects you personally every moment of your life without even any conscious effort, without any intent. And I'm going to come back to that sense of agency now as being a super important thing, because agency is anathema to those automatic effects of human interaction that collectively continue to increase acts of kindness and beauty and creativity in your life, are things that are of the utmost importance, because those aren't things that are done unconsciously. Those are things that are done with your will. Those are things that are done with your agency. And remember, with your agency comes empathy. Okay, and when you're empathic, you have a little bit more control over how this is shaping your thoughts, your beliefs, your behaviors, your buying and selling patterns, the way you treat your spouse, the way you treat your children, the way you treat strangers, the way you treat people that are completely different from you. This all comes back to these concepts of empathy, emotional contagion, and these weird sort of ignored parts of the sensory matrix, the sensory systems of the human body that I think really merit some much more complex scrutiny and analysis, both from the scientific, philosophical, and spiritual communities, because people just assume that things are the way they are, and that's just how it is. And yeah, sure, okay, that was a waste of a few words. But what I want you to think about is, how can that change? How can that change me? How can it change you? And how can I help change people around me for the better? And it's kind of an uphill battle, because there's an awful lot going on right now. I mean, our leaders seem to have all but abandoned us today. Corporations seem to have taken, so much from us. And yet here we are trying to continue to be positive and walk forward into our own futures. And we should. We deserve that. We deserve to try to feel good about things. But we all also have this sense of what's really going on. We have it. We feel it. I can see it. I can hear it. People talk about it all the time. There's just something in the air right now. There's just something going on. I can't quite put my finger on it. Well, I think that what's happening is that there's a big threat out there, and our bodies are all sensing it, and it acts in defiance of what we believe. It acts in defiance of what we want to believe. It is something that is evolutionary, and when you think about it that way, we realize that it is still important to have that system engaged and intact in our body, because like being stared at, like detecting a predator without seeing them, turning around and finding them there, like experiencing an emotion that you didn't originate. These systems are important to our survival. Don't abandon your emotions. Don't abandon your logic either, because we evolved that for a reason too. Don't assume that you get one at the expense of the other. I think that they make excellent co-pilots. And basically, when you move forward, take all the tools that you can get and put them in your toolbox, and find all the people that you can to get on your side and to link up with. I know I've got several friends right now that are just on fire. They're on fire networking and linking up and putting people together and trying to lift each other up and make things positive. And I'm seeing it locally in my community, and it's rather inspiring. And I'm hoping that, some of my contributions moving forward here on the Mayhem podcast can kind of sort of indirectly do that for you guys by giving you some deeper understanding of things, give you some food for thought and some things to think about, and some tools to take with you. I don't have a specific tool for this video. All I can do is recommend that you try to become more conscious and observe how this is unfolding in front of you in your life every single day. So in conclusion, my dear friends, I want you to talk about the knowledge that you've gained today with others. I want you to think about it and reflect on the importance of your own individual power to love those around you, because we share a vast emotional space that impacts everyone around us. Everyone. That's how important you are. Even if you're balled up under a blanket, if you're watching Netflix and you've been secluding yourself and isolating yourself and trying to protect your emotions and recharge your batteries, just remember There is somebody out there longing for your touch, longing to hear your voice, somebody who needs you because you're that freaking important, okay? And if that's not good enough for you, then I don't know what is going to be, but I want you to keep trying, and I want you to keep thinking about this moving forward. If you like tonight's conversation, I urge you to like our Facebook page, donate on Patreon. We need patrons. Share the hell out of this video. Follow us on Instagram. I'll have all of those links in the description. And, well, dear friends, I'm just going to have to say good night.